Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends, as you know, last year the UN Secretary General called for a food systems summit to unleash the power of food to drive progress across all 17 United Nations development goals. I thank you for stepping forward to become a leader for the food systems change. These dialogues bring together people from all parts of society to share evidence, experience, and new ideas. Food is powerful. The food we eat brings us together as families, as communities, and as nations. It underpins our culture, our economies, and our relationship with the natural world. The world's food system touches every aspect of human existence, which makes them valuable instruments of change. The reason we are having a summit this year and the reason we are here today is because we are off track. We are not set to achieve on our shared vision and goals for the 2030 agenda. Our food systems have staggering levels of inequality. Our key priority for this summit is to bring more inclusive, equitable, and healthier food systems while also safeguarding our planet. These dialogues are a core element of the summit process. They are an opportunity to come together and identify priorities and actions to be taken for a better future. This will be a people's summit, but it will also be a solution summit. Because everyone is part of the food system, we are looking to get all of you and your ideas around the table to ensure that action is owned and driven by different actors. We want action to be driven by you. Your leadership and ability to have courageous conversations rather than avoid them will be very critical. If we can't have courageous conversations about what needs to change and how we need to work together, then we won't be able to go very far. We need each of you to determine the food system you want for your future and to act on it to make them a reality. We must do this understanding fully well our place in the world and that what we do as individuals impacts on others. I look forward to working with you in this summit process. Together, we can build a world of inclusive growth, environmental sustainability, and social justice. We can build a resilient world where no one is hungry, no one is poor, and no one is left behind. I thank you.
It's a big ambition, and that's what we're here for. Hello, I'm Áine Lawler. I'm your moderator for today's event, which is the first of Ireland's part in playing its role in having its dialogues, the first of 4 national dialogues in the run-up to that UN summit in September. And thank you very much indeed to all our guests who'll be joining us today and to all of you joining us at home. And I want to say at the very start, the whole purpose of this is to have a conversation. We want to hear your views, and I'll be talking to you about how you can take part in just a moment. But let me give you an idea of what today's discussion is going to be all about. You'll hear in a moment from our chairperson, Sinéad McPhillips. She's the Assistant Secretary General at the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, and Sinéad is the convener of Ireland's Food System Dialogues. So she'll be talking to us about the work that's going on there. And we're delighted to have a keynote speaker today in Dr. Martin Frick, who is Deputy UN Secretary General, Special Envoy for that Food System Summit in 2021. So we can hear directly what the UN hopes can be achieved there. And then we're moving on to the discussion, and we'll be joined in our first panel by Tom Arnold, who chairs the Irish Agri-Food Strategy Committee. Also, many of you will know him, Professor Rogier Schutte from Wageningen University, and who used to, of course, work here in Teagasc. Dr. John Bell from the European Commission runs their Healthy Planet initiative, and also Caroline Keeling, who's the CEO of Keelings. And they're going to be talking to us about Ireland's 2030 food strategy and the difference in taking a food systems approach in that strategy. We'll hear from the panellists, and again, using Slido, I'll be talking to you about that in a moment. We'll be looking for you to take part there, and I'll be interested in bringing as many of your questions as we can to the panellists. And then we'll be moving on to our second panel, which is going to be dealing with that very difficult question of the trade-offs in particular between the environmental and economic sustainability challenge in the 2030 Agri-Food Strategy. And to talk about that, our panellists will be Laura Burke, who's the Director General of the EPA, Tim Cullinan, the President of the IFA, Pat Murphy, the President and Chief Executive of Kerry Group's Dairy and Agribusiness Divisions, and also Karen Ciesielski, the Irish Environment Network, and Karen is on the Environment Pillar on the Agri-Food 2030 Strategy Committee. So these are people who know an awful lot and can answer an awful lot of your questions, and certainly we're interested in you hearing from them and them hearing from you. Now, we're using Slido today, so please join the conversation online. And to do that, all you have to do is take out your smartphone if you haven't got it open already. You open your browser, go to slido.com and enter the event code, which is hashtag food systems, all one word, capital F, capital S, hashtag food systems. You should be in by now, so you can ask questions and vote for the ones you like. Now, we've started with a very quick poll to let us know, where are you? Where are you watching us from today? So that's going to be our first poll question. And I'll bring you more the answers on that during the break, so you can know about all the other people who are watching a little bit more and where they are. For more information for anyone who wants, it's on Ireland's food system and the UN Food Systems Summit this year. If you want to follow up on anything or know more about anything you hear today, you can visit the website gov.ie/food systems. And on that gov.ie/food systems, you can also register for all the upcoming dialogues, 3 more to come. And I'll be telling you more about those during the break between our first and our second panel. So we've a lot to come in the next 2 hours. I hope you can stay with us. The public consultation on the environmental assessment of the draft Agri-Food Strategy 2030 is now open until June the 15th. That's June the 15th. And again, if you want to have your say, go to gov.ie consultations, and that's where you can have your say. So as I say, a lot coming up in the next 2 hours. And to begin, I'll hand you over to our chairperson, Sinéad McPhillips. Sinead.
Thank you very much, Anya. Hello, everyone. My name is Sinéad McPhillips. I'm Assistant Secretary General in the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and I'm also the National Convener for Ireland's Food Systems Summit Dialogues, and I will be the chair for today's event, which, as Anya has said, is the first in a series of 4 dialogues over the next few weeks. In September this year, the United Nations Secretary General will host a Food Systems Summit to highlight the importance of food systems and their relevance to achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, by 2030. As you've heard from the video, this is intended to be a very different type of UN summit. It is designed as a people's summit, with every country in the world asked to host dialogues like this one, to ensure that a wide range of voices and viewpoints are represented. The focus will be on identifying solutions and actions which can deliver real progress on healthier, more sustainable and equitable food systems. These national dialogues are a central part of Ireland's engagement with the summit and will provide an opportunity to hear from a broad range of stakeholders, both on Ireland's own food system and our engagement with the global system. The dialogues coincide with the launch for public consultation this week of Ireland's draft Agri-Food Strategy for 2030 and its draft environmental assessment. This new 10-year strategy has been developed using a food systems approach, making Ireland one of the first countries in the world to do so. A food systems approach takes account of the linkages between food and health and food and the environment. It considers sustainability in all its dimensions, economic, social and environmental, with innovation as a key driver. Many of the members of the 2030 Strategy Committee will be taking part in these dialogues, reflecting not only their own areas of expertise, but also their shared experience over the last 18 months of strategy formation, listening to each other's views, sharing experiences, and working together to agree a shared vision for the food system that we want to have in 10 years' time. Today's first dialogue introduces sustainable food systems and Ireland's 2030 strategy. We will first hear a keynote address, as Anya has mentioned, from Dr. Martin Frick, who is the Deputy Special Envoy for the UN Food Systems Summit. Martin will explain why sustainable food systems at local, regional and global levels are of such great importance to achieving a sustainable future for all people and the planet, as well as the outcomes that we can expect from the UN Summit in September. 2 panel discussions will follow. The first panel will include Tom Arnold, the chair of the 2030 Strategy Committee, and will look at the key elements of the draft strategy from both a national and an international perspective. The second panel will address the synergies and trade-offs between environmental and economic sustainability. Many of you will be aware that the environmental pillar withdrew from the 2030 Strategy Committee before the end of the strategy formation process. So I am particularly pleased that Karen Ciesielski from the environmental pillar will join this panel to give some initial reactions to the draft strategy. I hope that these dialogues will provide an opportunity for all stakeholders, from farmers and fishers right through to consumers, to learn more about Ireland's food system, to build our understanding about the big challenges and the big opportunities we face, and how we can work together to address them. It is important to say that we are not looking for consensus today. We hope to have an open discussion and to listen and learn from each other. I would like to acknowledge and thank the RDS for their support in hosting these national dialogues. Agriculture and rural development has always been a vital part of the work of the RDS from its founding in 1731, 290 years ago. This work continues today in events such as this one, with a programme that focuses on the sustainable development of rural Ireland. As Anya has said, just a reminder that we are using the hashtag foodsystems in any social media around the dialogues, so please feel free to use that. I will now hand the floor to Dr. Martin Frick for the keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary General. And it's difficult to start because you already met so many of the important points. I want to start by thanking Ireland, because really this summit would not exist without also Ireland's leadership asking early on for a food system summit. And as you said, there were food summits before, but having a summit that looks at food as the entire system is new. And this is, I think, one of the key messages here, that for so many years we have looked into food issues from a sort of ministers of agriculture perspective only. We know today, in the midst of a pandemic, that nutrition is the key element in making a population resilient against pandemics such as COVID. We know at the same time, with recent documentations from FAO, for example, that food as a system, not only agriculture, but cooling, transport, plastic wrapping, and very importantly, food waste, amount to more than 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I spent many years in the climate process, and we have been looking into issues like car traffic and air travel and all of these issues, but we need to look into agriculture and food production as one of the key drivers. And it goes for 2 ways. Agriculture and food production, as the world sees it today, is all too often part of the problem. In many countries, it's a driver of deforestation. It's a driver of ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, consumes too much water and emits too much greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, solutions are at hand. We can turn agriculture, we can turn food systems into a force of ecosystems restoration, into a carbon sink. And that is something, and let me say that at the outset, which needs innovation, as was said, and also an open mind. I found it remarkable, Assistant Secretary General, what you said, that you don't expect a consensus from this conversation. And having engaged with all the countries of the UN membership, civil society, producer organizations, we know how difficult these conversations can be. And what we are offering is an honest conversation using the platform of the UN Food Systems Summit and bringing your issues all the way up to world leaders. The summit has been phrased, and Dr. Kalibata, my boss, just said it in the video, as a people summit and as an action summit. And these are not buzzwords, because in 25 years I have worked as a diplomat. I haven't seen a summit which has such an inclusive format. Let me give you 3 examples. Number 1, the thinking machine of this summit is 5 action tracks on access to safe and nutritious food for all, on shift to healthy and sustainable consumption, on nature positive production, on livelihoods, and on resilience. In a normal UN process, you would have these action tracks co-led by 2 ambassadors or by ministers. Here, we took actors from civil society and put the experts in charge. We have in action track 1, for example, Ireland participating in all 3 areas, on eliminating hunger, on working on better nutrition, and so on. But it's not only countries who are there and whom we are listening to. We have representatives of indigenous, smallholder farmers, academia, civil society, business associations, because we want to hear from everybody. And that is what this summit is going to do. Come September, the Secretary General will issue a statement of action, and that will duly reflect what we have been hearing in this process. Let me come to the second bit, where we are today. We have invited the countries of this world to host national level food system summit dialogues. You are right now participating in one. As of today, we have 103 countries who have nominated national conveners, which is the first step of this process. We have had 66 of these dialogues so far. And again, these are not easy conversations, but they are necessary ones, because they bring together the ministers and the ministries of agriculture, but also health, youth, infrastructure, environment, planning, all the different ministries that need to be at the table, because food systems are so central to our human well-being, to jobs, to our environment, and ultimately really to stay within planetary boundaries. And that is a key concern these days, because the scientists, and I have been working with IPCC for many years, have really been on the conservative sides. Many of the things that we see today happening were projected to be a problem in 2030 or in 2040. And what's frightening is that in some instances, we are coming close to what scientists call tipping points. And that basically means an irreversible loss of ecosystems, irreversible. We are going over the cliff and we cannot undo that. So we must avoid that, but we must not be blind to people, to agriculture as being the biggest employer there is, and so many livelihoods depending on it. There are ways out. There's discussion around quality, reduction of food waste, looking into the production methods. And all of that requires really an all of society process, as this one is just kicking off today. I would be remiss if I wouldn't thank Ireland also for the financial contribution, because you have been believing from the outset in the necessity of such a summit and have also contributed financially to making this summit a success. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you today and to hear from Ireland when we will be at the head of state level in September and bringing the experiences of the entire planet together. This is not going to happen overnight, but heads of states and heads of government will present their 2030 pathways, the 9 harvests we have before we are at 2030, what we can do really to eliminate hunger, as we promised it in SDG 2, to work to eliminate poverty, to stay within the planetary boundaries, be it fish stocks, be it land resources, and to finally come to grips with climate change. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention and would give back to the moderator. Thank you very much indeed.
And Dr. Frick, thank you, because you certainly set out the challenge that we face. And it's time now to meet our very first panel, and I'm delighted to welcome, many of you know him already. He is the chair of the 2030 Strategy, Agri-Food Strategy Committee, Tom Arnold. Tom, I didn't know your primary degree was in agricultural economics.
It is indeed, from UCD.
Well, you learn something new every day.
Absolutely.
So Tom is going to be talking to us about the work of that committee. We're also delighted to be welcome. Joining us remotely is Rogier Schulte. Rogier is chair of the Farming Systems Ecology at Wageningen University, where he focuses on the radical redesign of sustainable foodscapes. And Rogier, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure.
We're also delighted to welcome Dr. John Bell. He's the Healthy Planet Director of the Directorate General of Research and Innovation in the European Commission. And with all the talk about the European Green Deal, Dr. Bell, we're very much looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you. And we're also joined by Caroline Keeling, who's the Chief Executive of Keeling's, an Irish company, 100% Irish owned, and anyone who hasn't eaten a Keeling strawberry in this country, well, I don't know who they are, because I think we all have, and Keeling's is well known to all. Tom, I want to talk to you first of all about the 2030 committee, the committee you chair. What is it? Where does it work at? And what are its challenges in the months ahead, given this critical summit with the UN in September?
Okay. Well, could I start, Anya, by saying how delighted I am that you're moderating a national conversation on this strategy over the next 4 weeks, and I hope it's going to be hugely productive. The strategy is the fifth in a series of agri-food strategies which have been in place since the year 2000. And we were asked to start our work in November of 2019, just before COVID. So in answering your question, what I'd like to do is perhaps say, what was it we were asked to do and how we went about it.
And how the world has changed since then.
Yeah. Secondly, what is in the strategy? What have we actually proposed? And finally then, what's the big idea of this strategy? So in terms of what we were asked to do, we were asked to develop a vision for 2030 and propose policies to achieve that vision, to make the agri-food sector sustainable in its three dimensions: economic, environmental and social. And we did use, as was said already by Sinead, a food systems approach. Now that means in effect to say that we acknowledge the links between policies for food, environment and health. That's the first time this approach was used in any of the agri-food strategies up to now. But the second insight of a food systems approach is that we acknowledge that every part of the food chain has an important role in contributing to a sustainable food system, whether the primary producer, farmer or fisher, the input supplier, the food companies, manufacturing food companies, retailers, and also critically citizens and consumers. All of them have a role to play in this. So that's basically how we went about our work. We decided from the beginning we were adopting this approach. Now, what have we come up with? Well, we stuck with the terms of reference. We wanted to try to tease out and articulate what the policies would be to achieve sustainability in its three dimensions. And I just want to quote a single phrase which connects to this and underpins this, to say that healthy environment, ecosystems and economies go hand in hand. So in terms of the more detailed recommendations, we're talking about 4 high-level missions to be achieved with specific policy proposals. And I'll briefly mention what these are. Firstly, a climate-smart, environmentally sustainable sector. Now, this is the most detailed part of the report. It spells out a whole range of ideas that should be put in place to achieve this, but it's informed by a statement in the executive summary as follows. The strategy recognises that there needs to be a profound shift towards more sustainable policies and actions nationally and internationally. So obviously we're fitting within national policy here. National policy is that we're working towards a climate neutral economy by 2050, and obviously the ag sector has to play its part in that. There will be later on this year the decisions by government about carbon allocations, carbon budgets for each of the major economic sectors, and we will have to build on what's already in the strategy, but we'll have to further adjust it in light of that. The second mission is to work towards viable and resilient primary producers with enhanced well-being. It could be said, and it has been said, that some of the previous strategies were very successful from a macroeconomic point of view or for a sectoral point of view, but the actual benefits of that success did not translate down to the primary producer. And I think there's a very specific focus in our strategy on dealing with this. The third area then is dealing with food that is safe, nutritious and appealing, trusted and valued at home and abroad. And that's where we make the connections between food and health, where we're arguing that there needs to be a much greater emphasis in politically and policy-wise on food and health. And then the fourth mission is looking to an innovative, competitive and resilient sector driven by technology. And that deals with the issues like the rapidly expanding world of agri-tech and the bioeconomy. Mm-hmm. And then to round all that up, there is the final chapter, and it's crucially important, on dealing with monitoring and implementing the range of policies committed to in the strategy. So against all that background, what's the big idea? The big idea is that we are saying, and the committee is saying, that Ireland should, over the next decade, become a world leader in sustainable food systems. Now that's a big challenge and a big ambition, but if it can be achieved, it will both meet the needs of Irish society, but it would also give Ireland a competitive advantage in our trade and economic relations internationally. But to achieve that, we're going to need cooperation across the board. This strategy provides the vision. Sinead mentioned that the environmental pillar pulled out before we finalised that vision. It's very good that Karen is from the pillar is participating today. She played a really important role in our deliberations up till February. But I hope that in the course of this public consultation and in the debate around it, that the environmental pillar could indeed come back and finalise, because this vision, this strategy is ultimately going to be finalised later on after this process of public consultation. So I think there's a lot to play for. We have a big national interest in having a high level of political and societal consensus around this strategy. That's our best guarantee it'll be implemented.
Okay. And Rogier Schutte, maybe you would talk to us about where, given where we are and given what we're aiming to be, a world leader in achieving environmentally sustainable agriculture, viable and resilient primary producers that produces safe, nutritious food that's trusted and that innovates and is resilient through technology. How do we compare with other countries at the moment, Rogier, and what do you see that we need to do to achieve that goal?
Yeah, thank you, Anya. I'm seeing a very interesting, almost third installment to a trilogy that for me started with the food harvest strategy, the food harvest 2020. That was also an agri-food strategy, very much with a volume target within an environmental context. Then we had the food wise 2025. Where we progressed to a value target with an environmental impact assessment. And now here we see the Agri-Food Strategy 2030 that really has, to my knowledge, is the first national strategy that has taken the EU Green Deal and Farm to Fork strategy and put environmental targets in the first chapter, in its first mission, within the context of social and economic sustainability. It is the first national strategy as such that I see. If I compare it, for example, also the Netherlands does have a vision for a future food system based around circularity, the circular food system, and that makes sense from a perspective in the Netherlands where sustainability is the debate is strongly dominated by a discussion on nutrients and how to manage those. But the big difference really is that the Netherlands, the Ministry of Agriculture, explicitly relies on the innovation potential of the sector itself to come up with the pathway and the solutions. And this is where we'll be watching the Agri-Food 2030 strategy very closely, particularly the last chapter that Tom is referring to on implementation and monitoring. Because what we see, when I talk to farmers across Europe, they share an experience that they know that the discussion and the debate on sustainability is a hot topic in society. What they fear most is that the challenge is put at their feet and that is left to them to solve by themselves. And as we're taking a food systems approach, I think it's important that we look at what everyone in the food system has a role to play, and no one can be left behind. And that implementation, it needs the orchestration of the different actors, of the processes, of the banks, of the policymakers, even of EU policy, of the advisory services with the farmers. And then we have a chance of making a difference. And we'll be watching the implementation of the Agri-Food Strategy with great interest from that perspective.
Roger, questions coming in already. Before I go to the rest of our panel, let me put, really it's the key question for an awful lot of environmental campaigners at the moment. Is a livestock-based system sustainable, or should we all be moving to a plant-based diet? Now, particularly here in Ireland, that's a big question. What's your take on it?
There's a difference there whether we're talking about our current European farming systems or the system that we want to aim for. The short answer is there is a role for livestock in sustainable food systems. And when we're talking about ruminants, there's particularly a role for grass-based ruminants within sustainable food systems and healthy diets. That doesn't mean that there is no challenges associated with the livestock sector. There are challenges here and today, but they can be addressed, and so that there is a role for the animals within a food system.
Okie doke, I'm sure that's a point we'll be coming back to, and thank you very much indeed for that, Roger. John Bell, how does all of this square, the work that's going on here, the conversation that's going on at the UN, but also we've all heard so much about the European Green Deal, and you're involved in the work on the Healthy Planet. So talk to us about the Healthy Planet Initiative and talk to us about Europe's plans for the Green Deal, how that's going to become a reality, and within what kind of time frame?
So, I mean, I think that the key point to say is that this is a point of departure, and what we're doing here in Ireland and elsewhere is to set out what the destination could look like, and the conversation is about convening everybody, and I mean everybody, in working out how do we get there. The European Union, if you see this Green Deal, it's not your normal policy that pops up every 5 years. This is a constitutional shift in what the European Union is for. All of our assumptions about the key life support systems are showing us, and I work in the research and innovation area, what is happening. The pandemic that's outside of this digital dialogue is an opening chapter in how the biosphere and the economy and society have to find new resilience and prepare for that, and we have to do it together. So the Green Deal of the European Union, which is setting out over 30 years beyond policy cycles, investment cycles, and any of the other normal cycles we work with, that we're going to get to the world, a continent that is not simply neutral in terms of our carbon budgets, but working within sustainable boundaries. And thirdly, and most crucially, trying to do this journey in a fair and just way. So the three aspects of sustainability. And it's not about talk. I mean, we've completely, and are in the process of completely reforming every single one of our policies, whether you're talking about farm to fork or biodiversity or pollution or circular economy. We're refitting the taxonomy for all of our financial instruments, our external policy, anything you can think of. It is a fundamental regearing of what we're for and how to get there. And now what to do to get there is you need to understand how you can work in shifting from one system to another. And to slightly reformulate the usual old joke in Ireland, we have to show that we can get there from here. Nobody can allow the wicked problems of things like water use or nutrients or livestock or all of the other things that we're dealing with to get in the way of trying to find solutions by taking pathways and involving everybody in setting a common destination. The Food Systems Summit at the UN is a convening point where perhaps we start to do for the food system, we move the food system to the center of these transitions by design, which is what we have to do. We're the first generation of people in human history who have to find this transition by design. And we're doing that in many different ways. We started off in the Expo with a Food 2030 strategy for research innovation to really see, can we actually convene and design in and have public engagement in the possible ways in which we can provide solutions. And Tom Arnold is actually chairing a group. It'll be our contribution to the Food Systems Summit, looking at all the knowledge that is out there and start looking to see what solutions are available to us. This move by Ireland is very significant, as Rohir has said. We need member states to convene the conversation and to set out not aspirations, but how they're going to be realized. And a lot of the journey ahead, which will be over decades in some cases, with clear targets in the European Union for 2030. How do we convene the means to get to that point? Where I'm working in terms of research innovation, we think the mission-based thinking is the right way to go. We're launching in the coming weeks 4 large Green Deal missions, which, if you like, they're the equivalent of moonshots, they're Earth shots, where we want to, on the one hand, target the restoration of 3/4 of Europe's soils by the end of the decade, with all that means for biodiversity and nutrient cycles and food and nutrition security and water. The restoration, the means to restore the entire water cycle by 2050 for our oceans and seas and rivers, and the development of 100 carbon neutral cities, alongside what will be the biggest single challenge, which is how do we manage the unavoidable disruptions of climate adaptation by building resilience in at community level on things like food, water, infrastructure, and so forth. So from the European Union's point of view, this is a very, very important moment to see a strategy which is not the end of thinking, but the beginning of a process. And in that, we have to take evidence and knowledge and build them and hardwire them into opportunity, because I think opportunity here is a very important word. When we come out of this pandemic, we're not simply looking at recovery, we're looking at building a resilient economy and society and ecology. And that's what this is about. It's convening people around the idea that even if we're starting to run out of time, we're not running out of ideas. And as a challenge for Ireland, perhaps it's unusual for Ireland to be thinking about future geography rather than past history. The question is, can Ireland, with its position and its geography and its knowledge of food systems and what that means for people in different ways, can it be the green heart of the Green Deal in 10 years' time?
Questions come in on Slido, John, just before I bring in Caroline, that Ireland's a small country, so why should we be trying to be that green heart of the Green Deal? Why should we be trying to be the world leader Tom Arnold spoke about, in your view?
Because we can. There are many parts of the world which can't. If I can tell you some of the data that I'm looking at, for example, people complain about the rain and worry about the grassland sectors and so forth. Just to give you a detail on climate adaptation, the Rhine River dried up a couple of summers ago, to the point that we could only move a fifth of what normally moves forward. It means there's major challenges coming to whatever we think of our assumptions about food systems. With food systems, we have to get ahead of the problems and we have to convene everybody in working out what the destination should be. As a suggestion, there's a great contribution from Rohir's University in the Netherlands as part of a conversation like this, where they designed what the Netherlands could look like in 100 years' time if it took every available innovation and nature-based solution and redesigned the city. And it created a huge movement forward. So Ireland, I think, is fortunate, number one, as a reasonably coherent country in which you can actually move things together through this kind of dialogue and conversation, where decisions can move forward. You look at the focus that brought Ireland into a different context 25 years ago in the peace process. It's that kind of systemic change that we need. And it takes somebody to start and to move things forward. And I think, of course, Ireland has a particular role, both in the European Union and in the United Nations Security Council, and as a trusted player in all of this, which has its own specific challenges. Ireland does not have an easy pathway here. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have to start somewhere. And this is an excellent place to start.
So, Caroline, there's no shortage of lofty ambition here in all of this. Tell us what difference that makes to you in your role at Keelings, and what opportunities you see for yourselves as food producers in the strategy that's being discussed now.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to work on and see some of the new thinking. So I definitely see a new way of looking at the whole food industry. In the past, it was very focused on just itself and the very actors, right within the food industry. But as we start to look at health and as we start to look at the environment, I think it broadens it out and it makes for better decision making. So for us, looking at health, I think there's a huge opportunity there. One of the recent surveys we did showed that about 57% of people really want to eat 5 a day, but only 18% are eating 5 a day. So there's a big gap on what do we do in horticulture to enable Irish consumers to eat that 5 a day that they want to. And I think one of the things this strategy calls out is for the government, and I think the government will work with the industry, the department will create this horticultural strategy based on the guides that are laid out within this document. And there's a number of key things. One call out is for increased production. I think, we need to target what we want to increase. There's a lot of opportunity for import substitutions, etc. And there's a lot of opportunity for us as an industry to move forward. And I think that link with health and getting the food policies, both, in health and in production, connected up with each other, I think will show a lot of opportunities. I think there's call out to get more collaboration, potentially under POs. There's a number of areas of improvement that we can drive innovation in the industry. And I think the document has called out a number of areas that need to be included in the strategy, which hopefully will end up with a healthier industry and a healthier nation.
Has horticulture, if you like, been an overlooked sector in Irish agricultural policy? And in terms of technology and innovation, because the challenge here is to, produce more food and cut your environmental impact. Now, that's kind of a circle to square right there, isn't it?
It's a challenge, but, we're all of us producers are living on the planet too. We have to. It's not optional. So we have to find ways to do this. And I know from Keeling's point of view, we've looked at it and we've signed up to the carbon pledge. We don't know how we're going to achieve the stuff we have to achieve in the end years, but it's not optional. We have to do it. And I think every part of the industry has to do it, but growers need help to do it. We need supports, we need encouragement, we need innovation being supported, because the current solutions probably won't give us the result we need. It'll add cost. We need to, for want of a better term, reduce the green premium and ideally eliminate it. And that's what we're going to be working on. Sorry.
Thank you, Caroline. Raja, it's just I saw Rajier nodding his head when you were talking there. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we square that circle of increasing, particularly, say, Irish horticultural output, and at the same time cutting the environmental impact.
Well, it goes back, Anya. If we step one level back, it's very difficult for individual farmers to make changes. There's good reasons why farmers farm in a particular way. Their farming systems have evolved, and they have commitments. They have commitments to their bank. They have commitments to their processor. They have commitments to their suppliers. And it's very difficult for one person to jump out of those constraints. And that goes back to what I said earlier, is that we need all the actors to jump at the same time. And that calls for a redesign of some of our farming production systems where we can square that circle. And it depends on the sector, on the specific sector, where the solutions lie. Now, it's not just theory. We also, as what we do in our group here specifically, is we go around the world looking for examples of farming systems that have somehow already escaped the constraints that all the other farmers find themselves in, and have found a way of overcoming those old challenges and find those win-win scenarios by redesigning their farming systems. And they're kind of already farming as if it's 2050, and as if and they're ready for the sustainability challenges for 2050. And what can we learn from them? One example, one very simple example, is we work a lot with Finland, and one of our lighthouse farms there is working on becoming a net exporter, not only of food, but also of energy. Now, traditionally, that was also a contradiction. If you use land either to produce food or to produce bioenergy, and one of more means less of the other. But by a redesign, they found a way where they produce more food by producing bioenergy. And those are the win-win scenarios that we're looking for. Also, it's interesting that we have a lighthouse farm in Ireland, the Lanza Douth, where we're trying to overcome that old dilemma between ruminant production and greenhouse gas emissions, and where we're working towards carbon neutral livestock production to show that it can be done and that solutions are out there. That doesn't mean that every farmer can just change tomorrow and adopt the same farming systems, but it does show what can be done, and it also shows the gap, what needs to be done, what all the actors in the food system need to be doing, what the European Commission needs to do in terms of the carbon farming accounting, the MRV requirements, to harmonize those, what is needed in terms of financial incentives, what's needed in terms of on-the-ground monitoring. Those are the stories that we document to show that the redesign is possible, and that we can overcome those old contradictions between production and the environment.
This business, Tom Arnold, of ruminants and that question of the livestock-based system, whether it's sustainable. And Roger is saying that there is a room for it within our system. Now, it's one of the more controversial decisions there. Again, another question that's come in. How can agri-food exports reaching 21 billion by 2030? And again, dairy, a huge part of that. How is that compatible with sustainability?
Well, on the plant-based, animal-based issue, we discussed this in the document. We acknowledge that there are many, let's call them Western countries, where there should be more plant consumption and less meat consumption. But you don't jump from there to say that Ireland should radically change its system of livestock production. Our system of livestock. Because, as Roger says, there are reasons why we have the production systems we have. And the grass-based system in Ireland is both sustainable, and it just makes economic sense. I mean, it's where Ireland has its comparative advantage. So the notion that you could have, certainly in any short-term time frame, a radical shift from our sustainable grass-based production, I don't think makes any sense either economically or indeed environmentally. What we are saying in the document is that we need an agri-food system which is more balanced, which is more resilient, and so we are talking about more nature-based production systems. We're talking about more, as Caroline says, more horticulture, more organic production. We're talking about less intensive forms of production. So that's the policy shift that this document is signalling. In terms of your second question about how can you move from, last year we had agri-food exports of about a bit over 14 billion. We're talking about achieving 21 billion by 2030. That can largely be based on an increasing value-added proposition. It's not actually underpinned by a suggestion that there's going to be significant increases in output. That's important to say. I think one of the Ag Climatize policy, which is the roadmap for improvement in the agri-environment space, there's a very clear statement which says that we can't likely attain our targets for 2050 if the national herd were to increase. So already we're signalling that there is, if you like, a limit to what we're likely to produce while meeting our environmental targets.
A new cap.
In a way, a new cap, yeah. I mean, I think what is a very clear statement in this document, a commitment to reaching environmental targets that are set down, that has to be based on two things: realistic targets that are monitored and implemented properly and delivered upon. In the past, that criticism could indeed have been made that previous strategies in the environment promised more than they delivered. That can't happen anymore.
And the fact that everything is happening on a joined-up basis gives you more hope that this time we will actually make progress in terms of delivery. John Bell, I want to bring you in on another point here in terms of sustainability, because the thing that many farmers would argue is that, you know, they love the land, that's why they do what they do. But one thing they want to see being made more sustainable is farm incomes. And one thing they fear in a lot of the talk about change and cutting outputs, carbon budgets, the cost of all of that, what they fear is that farm incomes will not be so healthy, particularly as you see maybe a shift, you know, into, you know, bigger commercial producers and, you know, a lot of small farmers then working on a part-time basis. And you have this issue, not just here in Ireland, but across Europe. Your take on all of that?
Well, I think when people use big words like systemic and sustainable, I mean, what people tend to leave out in the conversation is the transition for people and communities. And I think if you look at what has to happen here, there needs to be a rural regeneration process that goes along with these transitions. I'll give you a very clear example. A lot of the assumptions are not, what technology is showing us is showing that new sources of value, if properly distributed and properly engaged in rural communities, can give new opportunities. So for example, in Ireland, if you take one of the big dairy co-ops, they're now developing very high value added products from milk waste. So the milk waste, the lactic acid, becomes a very high value building block for biochemicals and bioplastics, which will replace fossil-based plastics. And because it's part of a cooperative, the value is distributed in a more even way than maybe sometimes is the case when you have seasonal variations in prices. You need also to develop in the economics of what we're doing here. We need to shift, if you like, from just talking about natural capitalism to a natural capital to a form of natural capitalism where we can put a value and a price on the ecosystem services that are being provided. And that is a much more sophisticated thing than simply, you know, planting some biodiverse flowers in the margins. What we're talking about, I mean, the systems change that we're talking about is not just for the European Union. There's a paradigm shift going to take place in the next 10 to 15 years. And the people who will be central to this are the people closest to land management, which will be carbon management, which will be developing very high value added services, food systems. It's also true in the land-sea connection in terms of the waters and fisheries and so forth. There are entirely new areas of value that can be rooted in a process of rural regeneration, rural renaissance. And that's one of the reasons why things like research and innovation, which in many countries is very far away from rural communities, is not the case in Ireland, it's not the case in the Netherlands. Farming communities, forestry communities, fisheries communities need to be part of having access very quickly to how these solutions can fit into this new paradigm of where value can be generated and distributed. So I think most of us are applying the assumptions that we know. A lot of what is going to need to be done and incentivized will be about farming communities getting the incentives that they need to live their lives the way they want, and indeed for these communities to flourish. I give a very small example. In Iceland, I was talking to some people whose communities are much more isolated than ours, have been regenerated because the waste from fisheries is now generating again very high value added contributions to cosmetics and bio nutrients. And that has led to people being able to stay where they want to live and to build new businesses and to sell the value out of that, and the communities themselves then to begin to reform. So if you get it right, if you listen properly to the mix and you bring in the innovation, some of which will be business innovation, social innovation. We're not just talking about, you know, mad scientists coming out of labs with solutions, but we're talking about shifting to a new system. And a bit like our country did, you know, 150 years ago, when everybody sat down and said, we want a different kind of country, and you had the formation of the cooperative movements with Horace Plunkett and various other organizations, sporting and otherwise. That's the kind of change that has to take place here. So the fair and just language that's used, it's a very difficult one to crack in the short term, but that has to be the destination. That's why the conversation is absolutely critical, and the governance of the process is very important.
You talk about natural capitalism. What's that old expression? There's money in muck. That's something I think we'll all be learning a lot more about. Caroline, one question that's come in, and I'd be interested in your take on it from Keeling's point of view. What do you see are the main areas needing innovation in the food system? Where should the focus be?
I suppose I'd probably be closer to the horticultural side, but I do see innovation in how we can produce with reduced carbon impact. So the ones we'd be looking at would be glass houses. At the moment, you know, we use gas, natural gas to heat and also to give us the carbon dioxide for the crop. But as we move forward, how can we grow product under glass, heated, you know, in a carbon neutral way? That's going to be critical. I think the constant challenge we have on cost is another area of innovation that is needed. I think automation is going to be required in the industry. It's very low at the moment, but I think over the next 10 years, when you look at some of the developments that are coming out with robotics, I think there will be an increased level of automation in the industry, and I think that's going to be needed. If we solve the situation around, you know, carbon neutral glass houses, can we have, and carbon neutral cheap energy, can we do lighting? So will Ireland be able to produce some crops year round that we currently can't? So there's a lot of, let's say, innovation on the horizon that could be quite exciting for us.
It's fascinating stuff, and I have to wrap this panel up shortly, but Tom, I'll give, this is a good question, I think, particularly because I know you are looking for people to come forward in terms of consultation on the strategy, but it's also about implementation of whatever we come up with. So how can we get people more involved locally, whether it's in cities, whether it's in small towns, villages, or out in rural Ireland?
Well, you know, I think there's a capital that we have to already build on. There's a great tradition of local involvement in things. I mean, one of our members on the committee, Kieran Callanan from West Cork, has a whole lifetime's history of getting engaged in local development, promoting local leadership, etc. This strategy is very much about that. It's about encouraging more innovative ways for local people to take their own, if you like, future in their own hands. And I think there's going to, and as John Bell says, there's going to be many more opportunities in the evolving bioeconomy to do that.
And it was interesting as well, wasn't it, what Roger was saying, because, you know, a lot of individual farmers, you know, the scale of what we're trying to take on, we heard John Bell talking about the scale of the challenge. Yeah. A lot of individual farmers, a lot of individuals feel it's too daunting, what can I do?
Well,
you know, I've no choice except to get my food from the supermarket or whatever.
You equally, I mean, I watch every week Ear to the Ground. There's a stream of fascinating innovation that's highlighting, for example. So I don't think there's any shortage of out there. It's just that I think we need to value it, celebrate it, and promote it a lot more. And this strategy is encouraging that.
All right. Well, Tom, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank all my panellists today, Rogier, Caroline and John. Thank you all for your contributions. I certainly found the time flew. And thank you, by the way, for the questions that came in, and keep them coming for the panel that we'll have, our second panel coming up shortly. I don't know if there's anything like a virtual round of applause, but a virtual round of applause for a very interesting first panel. And thank you all very much. Now, a couple of things I'm going to give you right now. The results. Remember I told you we were using Slido here, and I gave you a Slido poll question, which was, where are you? And do we have the result of that one yet, or will I give you the second Slido question? No, I'm going to give you the second Slido question. So here it is. In your opinion, what's the most important priority for Ireland's future agri-food system? And the answers you can choose from: 1, biodiversity; farm incomes; 3, local food production and consumption; 4, competitiveness; 5, diversification; 6, climate adaptation and mitigation; and 7, other. We'd be really interested to see the responses on that. Do we know where everybody is watching us from yet? Do we have the answer on that, by any chance? If we do, it's not up in... Oh, there you go. Primarily from Dublin. But you can see Cork, Limerick, Kilkenny, Kildare, Wicklow, Galway. Shout out to all of you. This is a bit like Eurovision, isn't it? Looking who's coming in. Thank you to all the way... by the way, to all the people who've joined us from Northern Ireland, also Longford, UCD, rural Tipperary, Fermanagh, Tralee, Mullingar. The Netherlands, thank you very much. Liffey, Meets and Cavan, a shout out to you. So thank you to all of us, and keep those questions coming. Before I talk to you about the second, go ahead and talk to the second panel, I want to talk to you about the other dialogues that are coming up. So the next one is going to be on the 26th of April. And that's going to look at the really important topic about the health and well-being of people and society. It's going to be chaired by Dr. Pamela Byrne, who's the Chief Executive of the Food Safety Authority Ireland. And the keynote address, a man very familiar to us all at this stage, and someone I know a lot of you will want to hear from, and that is Dr. David Nabarro from the World Health Organization. He's their Special Envoy on COVID-19, and certainly, and this is something I'll be talking about with the panel now in part 2, our second panel. COVID has been teaching us, you know, things we never could have imagined before. The world has changed so dramatically. So it's a really good example of how the world can shift gear and how people can pivot and adapt in the face of remarkable challenges. And a lot of climate activists making the point that we need that scale of effort, that scale of change and innovation, if we're serious about meeting the climate challenges that we're setting out for ourselves at official level. And the panels there are going to be talking. Panel A will be dealing with healthy diets for all, sustainable food systems for safe and nutritious food, and also panel B, social sustainability, preserving our communities and culture. So that's the 26th of April. The third dialogue, May the 4th, promoting, oh, that's opening up day, isn't it, if the government makes the decision? Anyhow, let's not speculate on all of that. May the 4th, promoting an inclusive food system for the future. The keynote address there would be from Dr. Colin Sage, independent scholar of food systems and sustainability, followed by 2 panel discussions, which will be looking in more detail at food systems transformation, a discussion on future needs. And that's looking at young people. Yes, young people will have a critical role in shaping sustainable production and consumption and forging new connections between rural and urban society. And anyone rearing daughters will know that they certainly these days, if they're anything like mine, talk to you about and make you change the way you shop, make you change the way you eat, even though I'm still not persuaded about quinoa. The second panel will be looking at food systems transformation, the role of research and innovation. And the final dialogue, just before I go back and introduce you to our second panel, that's going to be on the 17th of May, and it's going to be dealing with aligning domestic and foreign policy policy towards sustainable food systems, all highly important, of course, in terms of that UN summit. It will be chaired by Rory de Bourke, who's the Director General of Irish Aid, and we'll have keynotes from Dr. Susanna Moorhead, Chair of the Development Assistance Committee at the OECD, and Dr. Jamie Morrison from the Food and Agriculture Organisation. And again, 2 panels there. So put those 3 dates in your diary. They are April the 26th, May the 4th, and also May the 17th. And they're also in my diary as well, because I'll be chairing those. This really is an interesting discussion, and it's time now for me to introduce our second panel to you. And panel B, we're joined by Laura Burke, who's the Director General of the Environmental Protection Agency, and she has been with the EPA since 2004. Tim Cullinan is President of the Irish Farmers Association since December 2019. He's from Toomevara in County Tipperary. Pat Murphy is President and Chief Executive of the Kerry Group's primary dairy and agribusiness sector. And also joining us on the environmental pillar is Karen. Now, Karen, you'll have to help me with the pronunciation of your surname. I am told, if I have it right, that it is Karen Ciesielski. Do I have that right, Karen?
Yes, Anya, that'll do. Yes, absolutely. Okay. Thank you.
Karen, actually, maybe on this one I'll start with you. Because Tom spoke about your departure from the National Strategy Group before the end. He welcomed the fact that you were here today, and he hopes that the environmental pillar will be part of this discussion going forward. So why don't you tell us what your problem is and what you think is not being addressed that should be more?
Okay. Well, first, I hope everyone can hear me okay. Is that, yes? Okay. Well, first, just to kind of frame my inputs this afternoon, we've seen, obviously, the strategy. It was published 2.5 days ago, or it was published on Saturday, giving us just a few days to sort of, digest and look into the substance of the document. So we're doing that. But at first read, I do have some comments to make this afternoon. And really, this document is framed as ambitious and rooted in sustainability. And throughout the committee process, we asked that this ambition is guided by science and backed up by milestones, indicators, and targets in terms of how it would help address the long-term goals of addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis, as impacts from agriculture are wide-ranging across water, air, climate, and biodiversity. It's also important to remember that we're coming from a place where, despite repeated commitments to sustainability in the past through past agri-food strategies, rather than cutting emissions and pollution, these have increased. So over the past 10 years, our numbers of dairy cattle have increased by 400,000, which makes us an outlier in comparison to our EU counterparts. It's also the past decade has shown that this approach hasn't worked and it's actually been quite detrimental and had huge negative impacts on climate, biodiversity, water pollution, and also ammonia. Yet this strategy doesn't really do enough to ensure that we are operating within regulated limits on, for example, national nutrient inputs, and also intensive dairy and beef outputs. So also, we heard a lot of feedback from farming families, which I know Tom referred to earlier, that the previous strategies didn't serve them well. So the message for us as civil society and as folks interested in environmental sustainability is very clear that we need a change in direction, and one which supports farming families and fishers to adapt to sustainable practices and to more sustainable practices. So just at first read, there are indeed positive elements of this strategy. For example, it includes the 30% target of highly protected marine protected areas by 2030. We called for this during the committee process in a submission, and we welcomed it and we continue to welcome it. However, we have to note that we still haven't met the 10% target that we were supposed to have achieved by 2020. And this strategy doesn't provide a roadmap of how we're going to get there. It also doesn't include a plan of how we're going to end overfishing. The language is quite vague. For example, it says we'll work towards sustainable fishing, but it doesn't commit. And this really is the crux of the problem, Anya. With vague language and loose targets and scant accountability, if those targets aren't met, there are simply too many gaps for this to be a credible plan with sustainability at its core, in our view.
Listening to you, it sounds like trust is a huge issue. What do you not trust?
Well, I think we've seen targets being set and we've seen ambition, and the language used in this strategy and certainly throughout the committee process was very promising. And even the framing that it would be a climate friendly system, one that is sustainable and puts communities and the environment on an equal footing, along with economic benefits and social sustainability. And that all sounds wonderful. But when you dig down and drill down into what's actually in the strategy, I mean, the dairy outlook from Teagasc is actually increased over the next period. So we don't see how it is credible that this strategy is coherent with those kind of plans.
And Tim Cullinan, from the farmers' point of view, there are issues of trust around this strategy too, aren't there, and the level of change that's being required. So talk to us about your trust issues.
Of course there is, Anya, and look, it's always about trust. And as I said, I come from Tipperary myself, and I come from the heart of the Golden Vale, where we've been farming for many, many years. I suppose if we go back on this and look at how we have evolved as a nation, and you could go back over 30,000 years where farmers in Ireland have been working with the lands. And I suppose we evolved. I have a phrase, you come from the soil to the plate. And, farmers have been custodians of the environment for thousands of years, and we are now. And okay, there is trust and we face challenges. We're up for them, and we have always said, and I have worked with Tom on this strategy. It was my first strategy, and I was absolutely delighted to be representing all farmers on this strategy. And what we're doing here is, there is challenges ahead, but we are willing to deal with them. We have a growing dairy herd in Ireland, which is very, very important, because if you look at it, farmers was restricted by quotas up until 2015. A huge amount of money has been invested by farmers since then in their businesses and in the co-op structure in Ireland as well, and that's very, very important. And what's very important here as well is, for every town and rural parish in Ireland, what we're doing, we're talking about sustainability, and there's three legs to sustainability. Obviously, the first one is that it's viable and societal and environmental as well, and we take all of those very, very seriously. But we have to start at the first pillar of viability. And if the sector is not viable, well then it can't operate. And if we look at it, and we look across the food supply chain, and actually I think it was very, very important that all the stakeholders in the industry was around the table putting this strategy together. And what has happened here over a long number of years is the primary producer has been taking the least amount from that chain. We take about 18% of the margin overall. So that is a concern in itself. And there's a lot of ambition and trust here. And we're looking at elements of the Green Deal, farm to fork, biodiversity, which we are embracing. But there's a cost on this. There's a serious cost. And I will be saying to our government, and I think Tom knows where I'm coming from on this as well, we're up for the challenge, we're up for the trust, we're up for everything, but there has to be a financial gain here for farmers. And I think, Anya, coming from where we're coming from, in the world, we've seen a pandemic, we've seen the effects of that, but what was critically important during all this pandemic was good, wholesome, nutritious food. And that's what we do, as I say, coming from the soil right up to the plate.
Pandemic also showed us actually how quickly we can all pivot and do things that we'd never had imagined before. And as I say, the argument on the climate change front is we're going to have to do that on that scale as well in that area. Now, Pat Murphy, I want to talk to you about dairy. Because that's come up a lot. And, whether we can meet the targets we're setting out for ourselves and meet the ambitions that many others have for growth in the dairy sector. Now, you're the man at the coalface there.
Yeah, look, Anya, I suppose the targets set out in the strategy are quite challenging. But I think, as Tim said, I mean, the industry is up for the challenge. The industry over the last 30 years, has coped with very difficult challenges, and delivered to the economy of Ireland. So I think someone mentioned there recently that the dairy industry contributes about 12 billion euro to the economy of Ireland, of which 4 billion goes into the milk suppliers, bank statements every year. So I think the important piece to call out is that if this is a whole of government and a whole of sector strategy and working together collaboratively, I do believe that the challenges that are set out in the document can be achieved. We have a great roadmap that Teagasc have made out, have published there going back last year. It's called the MAC curve. And there are some quick wins around fertilizer usage, around protected urea, around genetics of how we breed cattle, etc. So, and I think Tim mentioned as well, there's been a huge amount of investment at dairy farm level and at industry level over the last couple of years, and we have to continue that. There is an expectation that we have kind of entered maybe a stable period. There was very high growth over the last 5 years since quotas were abolished. But I think now we're entering into a more stable growth period. There'll be small growth. It won't be huge. But I think if we adopt what is on the MAC program, and we get our 17,000 dairy farmers across the country adopting best practice, whether that's fertilizer use or genetics or spreading slurry with different techniques or whatever, I do believe, the MAC curve states that we can take out between 17 and 20% of our carbon emissions out between now and 2030, which goes a long ways to what the Agri-Strategy 2030 is calling for. So I think by working together, all stakeholders, which is government agencies, the farm organisations, our dairy farmers, the industry itself, we are up for the challenge. I think it can be done. We look back at last year where we had a huge issue around COVID this time last year, and by the different parties working together, the dairy industry processed every drop of milk from farmers last year. By having the protocols in place, by pivoting, as you say yourself there on a while ago, very quickly. And I think that's the future. We have to add value, of course, as well. More volume is not going to solve any issue. We have to add more value to farmers, to primary producers, to the industry, and our customers are demanding this as well.
Okay, and I want to tease out some of that in a minute. At this stage, though, before I go to Laura for the EPA take, I want to give you the result of what you're thinking watching us. But when we asked you, in your opinion, what the most important priority for Ireland's future agri-food system would be, your choices were biodiversity. 12% of you thought that was the most important. Farm incomes, 15%. Local food production and consumption, 15%. Competitiveness, 6%. Now, diversification, sorry about that in my poor eyesight, 10%. But by a whopping margin, 38%, climate adaptation and mitigation. So that's clearly, it's a really interesting finding that, Laura, isn't it? That was so far out in front. And of course, that's what your job is in the EPA. So, we have ambitious targets. We've had targets before. We've a poor track record of meeting them. So how do we go from zero to hero between now and 2030?
And I think that's key. And we've seen again and again and again with various strategies that it's easy to write something on paper, but actually delivering it is a different story. And, EPA reports again and again have been showing that the economic growth of the agri-food sector is happening at the expense of the environment. We've increased greenhouse gas emissions, we've poorer water quality, we've increased ammonia emissions, which are actually exceeding legally binding targets, and our biodiversity is under threat. So what we're seeing is, on one hand, the talk, and on the other hand, actually the results. And from our perspective, when we look at the strategy, it is really positive to see recognition of the environmental challenges within the strategy. So it is clear within the strategy there is an environmental challenge associated with agriculture and the way agriculture is managed in Ireland currently. When you then look and say, how ambitious is the strategy and are there tangible targets? And in the context of ambition, I would say it's mixed. There's a lot of good stuff within the strategy, highlighted ideas, things we need to get on with. For example, nature-based farming, looking at carbon and storage of carbon on farms. And these are really good initiatives and also should be rewarding farmers for activities. However, when you look at some of the other targets, they're not ambitious. What they are is our legal requirement. So, for example, I would say to you, the ambition within the strategy is to reduce ammonia emissions to a particular extent.
By the way, again,
that's the legal limit.
Tell us where those ammonia emissions are coming from, because I'm just always conscious for clarity, and what we need and why there's such a problem.
Well, 99% of the ammonia emissions come from agriculture, and they come from everything from cattle to pigs and poultry. So it is agriculture where the emissions are coming from. And at the moment, what it is a sheer volume issue. And the impact it has an impact on air quality, which we all breathe, and it has also an impact on nature as well. So that's my criticism of the strategy will be, it is not ambitious to aim to meet a legally binding target. With regard to greenhouse gas emissions then, which was really interesting to see that level of interest, there is a commitment to a 10% reduction in biogenic methane. And on the face of it, I would say that's good.
That's methane from animals.
Methane from animals, exactly, and it's cows. That's or cattle. I'm sure Tim would criticise my knowledge of the different animals, but cattle. So that's the issue, and there is a commitment to a reduction of methane. On the face of it, that's good, because actually greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture have been going up over the last number of years. So we need to get them down, but they're actually on the wrong trajectory. However, what we don't have in the strategy is what's the base year? So when are we starting that reduction from? Is it from 2018? Is it from 2020? So what we need within the strategy is clear, tangible targets that everybody knows then whether we are successful or not. Because there's been a lot of talk this afternoon, which I think is great. It's really ambitious, saying, we need to change the trajectory of agriculture in Ireland. It is an incredibly important sector for the country, but we need to change the trajectory. Mm-hmm. But then we need all to be clear on what are the targets. So then we can see, are we hitting them or not? Because there's talk also about the MAC curve and ambitions to change how we manage agriculture. But it can't just be about efficiency. It can't be about being more efficient, because the environment doesn't know efficiency. The environment only knows the total impact of ammonia on our air quality, the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions, or the total amount of nutrients into the water, which impact the quality of the water that we all, whether it's we swim in or we drink, or animals and fish are in.
Karen, can I get you to address this dilemma of a young farm family in a part of the country that's ideally, like Tipperary, ideally suited to produce dairy? And when the quotas were lifted and there were opportunities for that family to do what all families want to do, improve their lot in life, and they expanded into dairy. And they have invested an awful lot in dairy, and they are very fearful of a future where they are being told that agriculture is the problem and dairy is one of the biggest parts of that problem. What do you say to that family?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to first start off by saying that farmers are indeed the sort of first protectors in the line of of the land in terms of soil, water, and air quality. And also, they're at the front line in terms of climate change effects, and also in declines in water quality, and also, a loss of natural habitats and species. They need nature and ecosystems to be working properly. And so do we, because we depend on farmers for food. So I think it's really important to place that in a broader context of we're all very dependent on farmers. And certainly as environmentalists at the environmental pillar, we recognize the pivotal role that they play and that they have played and that they must play in future. I think the main thing to really consider is that just, as we adapt to the climate and biodiversity crisis and emergency that we're facing, just transition principles and supports have to be put in place. So I think what is unfortunate is sometimes we get into a blame game, where one sector of society is blamed more than another. And I don't think that's very helpful to discourse or to finding solutions. I think we all need to realize we have to solve this together. And we all will have a role to play, no more than any other sector, but we all have to move in the same direction. So I would think that one of the main things, and certainly we'll be releasing a clear set of government policy recommendations in the very not so distant future, together with colleagues at Stop Climate Chaos and the Sustainable Water Network, where we have set out some really clear and strong recommendations that will support farmers and certainly local production systems as well, because I think that that's important to recognize. I mean, a backdrop to this conversation today is a very heavily productivist and export model that we have. So we're not talking about, supporting farmer families when we talk about billions and tons of liters for export. So if we bring it back and strip it back and talk about how we want to sustainably produce and consume food, the conversation is a little bit more open. And certainly supporting farming families has to be at the center of this move towards transformation.
Okay. And Tim Cullinan, let me put this question to you. Is your job as president of the IFA to resist as much of this as possible that's going to put, the burden of change on your members? Is it your job to make sure that agriculture gets the smallest possible share of the carbon budget that it's got to accept the burden of reducing and so on? Is that your job on behalf of your members? Hold back the tide?
Obviously, look, my job is protect farmers and protect farmers' incomes. And I agree what Karen was saying. It's important we all work together. As I said, we sat around the table, all stakeholders in the industry have worked together in this. And my job is two things. We are first responders to the climate. I think it has been mentioned already, and the word carbon here was mentioned. And Anya, if we look at...
But there's a massive amount of investment required for a farmer, isn't there? If, for instance, they're going to be kind of getting more for less, then they're going to have to be using a lot of very sophisticated and expensive technology that's available now, satellite technology and all kinds of fancy things nobody could have imagined 5 or 10 years ago. But they need to monitor every single aspect of what they do. They're relying, Karen was saying we rely on the farmers, they're relying on their bank managers.
Of course they are. And if we look at the ecosystems, and Karen is right, we work with the ecosystems every day. You're right, we're relying on the bank managers. The money is borrowed. Like, farmers have to continue doing what they're doing. We have to produce food. And where better place to produce it than a country like ourselves? We have the rain, we have the soil type, we have the hedgerows. And the point I wanted to make as well is, the farming system we have here in Ireland is different to any other country in the world, different to most countries in Europe as well. We have the smaller farms, we have the hedgerows, and we need to get to a point where there is acknowledgement. Like, we're getting the blame here for 30% or give or take of the emissions.
But farmers aren't getting enough credit for the protection.
But because we haven't a massive heavy industry in this country, okay? And we're not getting credit for what we're taking in the carbon we're taking into the hedgerows, into the trees. This is starting to evolve, but to have the full debate, we need to get credit for what we're doing as well. We need to get to a point where it's net carbon, that we're getting allowance and compensation for what we're taking in, and a balance on the other side as well.
I'll pick up on that idea of carbon sinks in a moment. Pat, there's a question that's come in. What are the key messages that the market, through consumers and society, is giving to food companies and farmers about the future of food? And would you address in that answer this question about Ireland as a food exporter? Because that's, it's a huge sector of our economy. It kept us going, apart from the multinationals, post-austerity. But is it compatible with true growth in the future if we're also trying to be more sustainable and meet our climate targets? Pat?
Sure, Anya. Look, our consumers and our customers across the world are telling us that we have to produce, and I'll talk about the dairy side, we have to produce dairy more sustainably in the future. We have to reduce our carbon footprint. So it's not just the regulators or the environmental pillar are telling us this. Our customers across the globe won't deal with the industry in Ireland if we can't prove that we are reducing footprint, that we're reducing emissions, and that we're getting more for less. So over time, I think that and if you look at, say, for example, in America, if you look at the food launches in America over the last couple of years, something like 15% of all launches now in America in food have a sustainability claim in them. And they are capturing 50% of the growth in revenue of market expansion in the States at the moment. We can see the same thing in Europe, where sustainability for our customers is becoming front and center. If we can't show that the industry, especially the dairy industry, is reducing footprint, they will buy their dairy from New Zealand or Australia or other places. There's plenty of competitors out there looking for the same business. I should go back then, of course. We would say that the carbon footprint of dairy in Ireland is almost best in the world. Ourselves in New Zealand, as Tim mentioned there, we have a grass-fed system. We have very good genetics improvement, working with the guys like in Moore Park over the last number of years, where farmers now have got huge genetic gain in the last decade. And so we're not getting as much water in milk as we were, and we're getting more solids. That's what it's all about, So I think that we have a great story to tell. We've got this traditional family farm. We've got 100 cows per farmer. It's different in America. We have 5,000 cows per farmer, and it's different in New Zealand, where you have another 500 cows per farmer. So our carbon footprint is lowest in Europe. It's lowest across most of the world. And we have to get that message out there through Board BIA and through the National Dairy Council about the positive attributes of Irish dairy, because I feel that we haven't done a great job in that over the previous number of years.
You spoke as well, Pat, about a more stable growth period. Tom Arnold was talking about, kind of a cap on the national herd. A lot of people would like to see it cut. Your thoughts?
Yeah, we have to look at the national herd rather than the dairy herd. I know that Karen is talking there that there has been a growth since 2015 in the dairy herd, and there has been. I don't think there'll be anything like that over the next 10 years or the next 5 years, where in certain parts of the country, there's been very little growth. In other parts of the country, there's been huge growth. But I think we have to look at it nationally. I think that the suckler herd is called, the beef herd is coming back every year. The dairy herd is slightly increasing. I don't think we can put a cap on dairy for the next 10 years because, if we don't produce that dairy, in Ireland last year, we produced 8 billion litres of milk. In Europe, in total, there was 160 billion litres of milk produced. So we have 5% of European production of milk, and we're the most efficient doing it. So if we put a cap in Ireland on milk production, it's only going to be produced in countries where their carbon emissions are higher, and it doesn't do anything for the global carbon footprint or emissions. So I think we can talk about a cap in dairy. Certainly there will be a slowdown, and I respect Laura's point that emissions are going up, and we have to reverse that. Absolutely, water quality is deteriorating in certain parts of the country. We have to address that. And for example, in there, we had this asset program working for the last couple of years, where we're working with the state agencies and the farm organisations and the farmers, and we are seeing improvements at local level on streams and rivers in Ireland, by working together and getting farmers to adapt what they're doing, and they are doing that. So there is success there. We shouldn't be too negative about it. And I think that Ireland has a big role to play. over the next number of years producing dairy for, we produce enough food for 50 million people. We've got a population of 5 million people, and we shouldn't cap that.
And Laura, how do you deal with that point that if it's not coming from Ireland's farmers under a greener system, it'll be coming from somewhere in the rest of Europe, and overall in terms of the planet, the impact will be worse?
Well, I think we have to be really clear that Ireland relies on our clean green image. And that's how we've sold ourselves, whether it's agriculture or tourism, over the last long number of years. And what we're saying is when you look at those indicators, we can't just say we're clean and green and promote ourselves as clean and green and not have the evidence to prove it. So actually, the way we're going, there is a serious risk to the reputation of the agricultural industry in Ireland when we are promoting ourselves abroad. So therefore, it's in our own interest to address these issues. And I suppose we're an organisation, it's science, it's evidence, it's fact, and what we are showing on the ground is these issues. What we don't want to have to do is, in the context of agriculture, is to be saying, well, actually, Ireland is a producer of agriculture, but it is impacting on our water quality, and we have poor water quality. We are, non-compliant with our legal obligations, let alone ambitions with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, etc. So I think it is in all of our interest, and the interest of the sector, most importantly, to tackle it, because it is a huge sector for the Irish economy. It's a hugely important sector. It is part of who we are. I live in the country. I have a forest behind me. I have a dairy farm in front of me. It is really part of where we are, but we have to protect that.
And another question that's come in on slide, how we promote more organic production and consumption, considering we're behind the EU average. And maybe within that you'd build in what Tim was talking about, this idea of, carbon sink farming and new ways of farming where instead of damaging the environment, it's actually mitigating environmental damage.
And also trying to look at the positives out of COVID, and there aren't many positives, but one of the things is I think we're a lot more connected to our local environment. We're all in our local environment a lot more. You're getting a sense of people being keen to buy local, to understand, the benefit, like being able to sell the benefit of whether it's carbon farming or organic or locally produced. And it is about, rather than the race to the bottom of more and more and more and cheaper, and this is where I would have huge sympathy for the farming sector, and Karen has alluded to it as well, is there needs to be recognition of when more investment is made, that there is a cost associated with that. But then we should also be getting, it's better quality food, it's better for us, it's better for our children, etc., and being able to promote that as an image.
There's something you've mentioned a couple of times before we go any further, and actually I'm struck by the number of farmers who've been involved in a lot of the environmental measures that are available, who've been creating, wildlife areas, but water, hugely important. Now, that's the positives in terms of water, but the negatives in terms of agriculture and water. The EPA has been banging that particular drum for a number of years. What is Ireland's problem?
Well, Ireland's problem is nutrients in particular when we're talking about this sector, and this is not all of Ireland. And this is the other issue, and one of the issues, particularly around water quality, tends to be a local issue. What's happening in the southeast of Ireland is different to what's happening in the northwest of Ireland. And it is local solutions that Pat was also referring to. But what we have is nutrients being released into our waters, and they are, nitrogen, phosphorus, and they are impacting on water quality. And what we have seen is an increase in those emissions and the impact over the last number of years. And I would have to say the southeast of Ireland, where you've seen increases in the dairy herd, that we're seeing as a particular problem at the moment.
Tim?
Yeah, I want to put this in context because we mentioned there about the national herd, and we go back to the 90s. Where we are today is we're back at the numbers we had in the 1990s. So I think that's important. We put this in perspective. And to say we can't blame agriculture for all the deterioration in water quality. There's other aspects going on out there as well. All we have to do is look at our local authorities, and everybody needs to work here together. It comes back to all the actors in the chain.
But you're not denying Laura's science, are you?
I'm not denying the science, but we're working on science as well. And as we speak, the science is evolving. Looking at to make up the genetics of our cows, that we can breed, change the breeding systems, produce cows that produce less methane. We're looking at the diets, developing new diets that will be less methane emitted from the cows as well. And all you have to do is look for the programme for government. There's a commitment in the programme from government where this current government is to relook at how the biogenic methane is accounted for in the first place. You know, we have Miles Allen in Oxford University saying it's not being appropriately accounted for. We have to look at all of this as well. You know, we need a balance to this debate, and it comes back to, if we look at it here as well in Ireland, within Europe, we have the most. We're involved in the most schemes, environmental schemes in agriculture in Ireland than any other country within the European Union.
Okay. So, Karen, what do you say here? Because we have Tim telling us that the farmers are doing more, and we have Laura telling us about, you know, the water quality is getting worse. You were talking about just society transitions. What's a just society transition got to offer farmers in fixing particularly this problem with our water quality?
Well, I think one of the main I would support what Laura said in terms, I mean, I think meeting our legal obligations, as Laura referred to earlier, for example, the Water Framework Directive, which we don't do. We currently are in breach of a number of legal obligations in relation to water, ammonia, and even if we were to see compliance as a baseline, that would be a help. In terms of responding to the point as well that Ireland is a global actor, and that, you know, we are exporting, and if we don't, someone else will. I mean, I know that we've done a lot of work with.
Oh, has there been a bit?
Do we have in the
no, we
development
have
sector?
Sorry, there was a bit of a glitch there, Karen. Go on.
Sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. One of the main things that's coming to us really strongly from our colleagues who work in the development sector is that the most important thing we can do to address global malnutrition and also play our part in terms of reducing global climate emissions is to get our house in order at home. So some of the arguments that we're talking about in terms of if we don't, someone else will, and, you know, we're very efficient, really, that doesn't change the fact that we need to adapt here. We need to reduce our emissions. We need to improve water quality, because as Tim rightly said as well, farmers cannot do their jobs without clean and healthy water, and you know, it also presents, as Laura mentioned, risks to our image as built, which is built on this green reputation. So I do, and in terms of protecting and supporting rural livelihoods, we should really be looking at, you know, rural regeneration. And I know we mentioned organic farming today as an example of activity that would be a positive impact and outcome of this strategy. And certainly the EU biodiversity strategy shows that organic farming produces 10 to 20% more jobs than does conventional farming on the same amount of land. So clearly there are benefits there to rural Ireland, in addition to our health and to the environment.
Look, as I say, these are dialogues, and I'm finding today's first dialogue really, really fascinating in the range of views. And I want to conclude now by asking each of you to give us your take on how well we're managing the inevitable trade-offs as well as the opportunities in the challenge of making our food systems and food system in Ireland more sustainable. Pat Murphy, what are your thoughts about, you know, we talk a good game, we've got lofty ambitions, the track record patchy, the export effort fantastic. So squaring all those circles, meeting our legal obligations, and also going further, because if we don't, there's an economic cost to that. So the tough trade-offs from your point of view in your business, your final thoughts.
Look, Anya, I think we recognise the challenges. It's not that we don't recognise that we have to reduce emissions and get water quality better as well over the next number of years, and also increase biodiversity. I think that as a sector, working together with government agencies, etc., we can overcome all these challenges. We have, the reputation of food production in Ireland across the globe is best in class. So, we need to focus on what we're good at in Ireland, and that's producing food for growth in population over the next 20, 30 years from 7 billion up to 10 billion. They will require food that's going to be produced in countries like Ireland because it's there where you can produce the most sustainable dairy or beef across this part of the world. So I'd be optimistic that we can accept the challenges. We have a roadmap in terms of the MAC curve, in terms of immediate ways of reducing emissions, which farmers are adopting immediately because we have the Signpost Farm program now up and running, and all the processors, the co-ops in Ireland are involved in this program. So we will show what can be done very quickly, and we will get the 17,000 dairy farmers across Ireland to adopt that best practice and hit those targets that we've set out in the Agri-Food Strategy 2030.
And Tim, farmers' view of the trade-offs?
Yeah, the trade-off, we're willing to work together, but Anya, farmers have to get compensation for what they're doing. Like farmers, there's a huge ask on farmers here, a huge aspiration. And I suppose if we look at it, there's also a challenge here to get from 14 billion up to 21 billion exports a year, which is important because that money will trickle down to every town and village in the country. And if we look at those exports from agriculture, for every 10 euros, 9 euros goes back into the local economy. If you look at the foreign direct investment, most of that money goes out of the country. But I want to just get back to what we can do, which is very important, working together. And I want to go back to the carbon, and we have to relook at that. And we have the most hedgerows in Europe in our farming structures here in Ireland. We have our trees, we have excellent grassland. And what we're doing here, we have to remember what we're doing here is we're turning grass into either meat or into dairy or into the other meats. And it's the most efficient way in the world of doing what we're doing. We have to continue doing that. Obviously, as you rightly pointed out yourself, the investment has gone in. My job is to ensure that investment is followed through and there is a return for farmers. And the other point we didn't touch on today is the whole area around renewables. Like, there has been no real incentive by our government to bring it back down to a local level where farmers can get involved in the whole debate and the challenge around renewable energy. I think that's another area where we need to move to. But I think it's critically important that all of the actors in the chain, right from the primary producer right up to the retailer and the consumer, who was very, very important in all of this, that we were all working and striving to achieve this together. And I think, to be involved in the food systems and the food systems summit, it's an excellent way going forward. It's new, it's a challenge for me as president of IFA, it's a challenge for all our members, but we're well up for it, and we will continue with the challenge.
And Karen, in terms of those trade-offs, do you see any evidence, for all your disappointment and reservations perhaps so far, do you see any evidence that the willingness to make painful trade-offs is stronger now than it was?
Yeah, I think, I mean, absolutely. I know that this strategy has different language used in it, and certainly even the discussion today with Pat and Tim has been heartening in terms of, discussing together how we can look at solutions. But I think really where we have the issues is in terms of accountability and also an over-reliance on kind of technical solutions and research and innovation, where we know what needs to be done. We need to make reductions in inputs and reductions in outputs. And we also need to comply with the law. So, those should be taken as read. And then we can move on and discuss how we restore nature, how we restore water quality, and also how we, in the long term, have permanent and steady declines in our climate emissions. And that's really, and also bring communities along. And I think that that's really important. When we look at the makeup of this, even the strategy committee, you know, I was appointed in a 31-person committee as the one voice of civil society. I don't think that that's acceptable. I think we need to have a broader decision-making process that is more inclusive and also transparent. You know, so this committee developed a strategy which is, by all accounts, going to become de facto government policy. And that's really not best practice in terms of having a blueprint that is going to support communities, support people, and support sustainability in the long term.
And your final thought, Laura, on the trade-offs. Do you think that the nature of the debate has changed? That, you know, whether we've gotten better at meeting, well, certainly 2020 was very disappointing. Do you think we'll be better 2025, 2030?
I think the dialogue has changed. I think it is really useful to have us all talking together rather than talking at each other, which may have happened in the past. I think there is recognition of the environmental challenges. I also think, and you know, Tom had alluded to it, but also Martin Frick and John Bell, this huge transition that we're about to go through. And I think of it as a huge opportunity. I'm trying to think of win-wins rather than trade-offs, because trade-offs tends to be such a negative concept, you know, as winners and losers, whereas actually there is a real opportunity here to do things differently that will be of benefit for everybody in society. So as I said, I'd like to leave with the glass half full rather than the glass half empty, but yes, the narrative is changing, and I think that's a huge opportunity.
Well, I'd like to thank you all very, very much indeed for sharing this conversation with us all today. It really has been a pleasure. So my thanks to you all for your participation in this panel. Thank you, by the way, to all of you for sending us in your pictures. We were delighted with an overwhelming number of questions and comments that have come in so far. There isn't time to address all of them in this particular event, but as I say, they are going to be included in the formal feedback of Ireland's National Dialogue series to the UN Food Systems Summit, and there are 3 more of these dialogues to go ahead. But time now for me to hand you back to our convener and chairperson, Sinéad McPhillips.
Thank you very much, Anya. I would like to thank all of our panellists and contributors today, and all of those of you who put questions to the panel as well. And a particular word of thanks to Anya herself for her expertise in moderating this as a real conversation between people this afternoon. Martin Frick, just to reflect on some of the key points that people have made during the conversation. Martin Frick made the point that agriculture needs to be seen as part of the solution and not just as part of the problem. And I do think that that's very important in terms of our future dialogues. He reminded us that we have literally a burning platform, and said what's frightening is that we are close to tipping point, the point of irreversible loss of ecosystems. Food systems are an essential requirement to the requirement of staying within planetary boundaries. Tom Arnold talked about what's new and different about the new draft strategy for 2030, and that is the ambition that Ireland should be a leader in sustainable food systems. The strategy recognises that there needs to be a profound shift towards more sustainable production systems. It recognises that the strategy will have to flex and adjust when new targets are set, for example, when carbon budgets for each sector will be set by government later this year. He also talked about the emphasis on bringing benefits to the primary producer, and I think that was a recurring theme throughout our conversation. The need for a greater emphasis on food and health and on innovation and the bioeconomy. Tom made the point that monitoring and implementation will be crucial to the success of the strategy. If achieved, the ambition of the strategy will be of benefit to Ireland as a whole and give Ireland a competitive advantage in our food production system. Tom also invited the environmental pillar to rejoin the strategy process before the strategy is finalised, and I'd just like to echo that request. Tom mentioned the high level of political consensus and societal consensus is the best hope of achieving the high level of ambition in the strategy. From the first panel also, Roger Schulte highlighted that, again, that implementation is key, that farmers fear that the challenge will be left to them to solve by themselves. And it is really important that that doesn't happen and that no one is left behind with all of this challenge on their plate. Sequencing will be also important, Roger said, and the orchestration, which I think is a very good word, of the actors to take these actions. He also said that there is a role in sustainable food systems for livestock and as part of a healthy diet, and particularly for grass-based livestock production. That it's not without challenges, but those can be addressed. John Bell from the European Commission emphasised the importance of the Green Deal at EU level, that the EU is reforming each of its policies in response to that Green Deal, from financial instruments to farm to fork, to achieve those ambitious goals. John also said we are where we are, which is not in a good place globally, and we have to get to our destination from here. That will require a paradigm shift over the next decade, involving carbon management and the blue economy, to generate new value streams and to involve farmers and fishers and incentivise them to take a part in those new opportunities. Also on the first panel, Caroline Keeling highlighted that there are big opportunities for horticulture based on the link between food and health highlighted in the strategy. There will be a new horticulture strategy for the sector in Ireland with significant opportunities for import substitution. And that we have to find ways to produce more, particularly in terms of fruit and veg, while working towards carbon neutrality. The second panel then, Karen Ciesielski emphasised that she's having a first look at the document at this stage, and that the document was framed as ambitious, but not seeing evidence of scientific milestones and ambitious impacts on water, air, and climate quality. Karen said that past agri-food strategies have not resulted in lower emissions and have in fact seen increased emissions. So that approach hasn't worked and has been negative on environmental indicators. Karen said that previous strategies didn't serve farming well and that a change of direction is needed with additional supports for farmers and fishers. She did say that there were some positives in the strategy, but too many gaps for this to be a credible strategy. Promising language has been seen in the past, but hasn't been implemented. Tim Cullinan said that farmers have been custodians of the land for thousands of years, that farmers are willing to face the challenge ahead, but will need support and incentives to do so. Pat Murphy, on behalf of the dairy industry, said that dairy industry and farmers are up for the challenge of addressing environmental sustainability. Laura Burke said that there were many good initiatives in the strategy to reward farmers, for example, for nature-based farming, but she also said that some of the targets are not ambitious enough, that they are just meeting legal requirements. Laura emphasised that ambition can't be about more efficiency. It has to be about the total impact of farming and food production on our environment. So I hope that's just a flavour, I suppose, of some of the key points that I took myself from our discussion, and I know there are several more which will be captured by our team and reported in to the UN system. Just to reflect myself, I suppose the difficult circumstances of the past year has reinforced for many of us the importance of good food and good nutrition for health and the value of nature for our well-being. It has given us a greater appreciation for all of those who work in the food system to ensure that shelves remain stocked, even in the most difficult of circumstances. For those of us involved in the food system in Ireland, there's no surprise about the international focus and discussion of the importance of food systems to sustainable development. We see every day the contribution that the sector makes to rural and coastal economies and communities and the environment. There is an urgency to addressing the challenges we face, particularly the climate and biodiversity emergency. So my own view is that rather than waiting for perfect solutions, we need to start acting now. making practical changes so that we are heading in the right direction, giving clear advice to farmers and fishers and the food industry, and indeed to retailers and food service operators as to what changes are needed, and then ensuring that those changes actually happen through a mix of incentive, regulation and knowledge transfer. For farmers in particular, the new CAP and other EU financing instruments which will flow from the Green Deal should offer supports to make those changes and investments needed on farm, and to offer opportunities to diversify and improve farm incomes. The research and innovation agenda at both national and EU level offers possibilities for new solutions and new and diverse income streams. We've talked a lot this afternoon about higher standards being imposed by the EU or indeed by our own national climate bill. But as Pat Murphy mentioned in our last panel, global food customers are also looking for sustainability credentials to give greater assurance to their consumers. Ireland has been a world leader in terms of the Origin Green programme in offering proof of quality and sustainability. And there is a sound basis to build further ambition into that programme. What the draft strategy gives us is a strategic framework for action. It's been put together carefully through an inclusive process. The draft strategy, along with its draft environmental assessment, is now open, as we've said already, for public consultation, and we would really welcome your input into that consultation. As Anya has said previously, you can access all of the documents on gov.ie/consultations, and that process is open until the 15th of June. In addition to these national dialogues, a number of independent dialogues have also been held in Ireland. We intend to include the output from those dialogues as well in the synthesis report that we will provide directly into the UN system. I would just encourage you again to register now for the forthcoming dialogues at gov.ie/foodsystems. In the next 3 dialogues, the first of which is happening next Monday, I think, the 26th, we will investigate the relationship between food, health and nutrition, and the importance of social sustainability and the well-being of people and society. We will look at how we build a more inclusive food system for the future and the role of research and innovation in food systems transformation. And we will address the challenge of aligning domestic and foreign policy towards sustainable food systems. I would like to again thank the RDS for hosting us today and to thank all of you for your participation. A lot of people have worked very hard to put these dialogues together, including my colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. I know they would want me to particularly thank my colleagues Paul Kiernan in Rome and Harry O'Crowley in Dublin, who have put in some very long hours and made my role as national convener of these dialogues a very easy one. Thank you very much.